welcome to Closer to the Fire from the voice of the Martyrs Canada. You know, most of us have heard about Christians suffering for their faith in Jesus. And I think we think about persecution mainly, how it impacted believers in times past, or maybe even hostile nations today. Maybe you think of like North Korea, China, Nigeria, or Pakistan, but really far removed from our daily lives. But my guess says that those who follow Jesus in this fallen world can expect persecution regardless of where you live. But it's important to know that there are various stages of persecution. So over the next 2 episodes on this podcast, we are going to explore the different stages or levels of persecution. Floyd Brobbel is the CEO of the Voice of the Martyrs Canada and recently released his first book called Trouble on the Way, where he shares from his decades of experience with persecuted believers around the world. Floyd, welcome to Closer to the Fire.
Hey, Greg, good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Excited about the new book. But before we launch into that and talk about, the different kinds of the stages of persecution, for you grew up in a home that the persecuted church was front and center. Your parents started Voice of the Martyrs Canada back in 1971.
That's true. Yeah, I grew up with parents who engaged with the Wormbrandts and started the ministry work in Canada. I don't think that they ever really envisioned Voice of the Martyrs in Canada growing as big as it did, or that it would consume their life as much as it did. But as Wormbrand, his name began to grow worldwide, and his message began to be received in churches, ministries across the world called Voice of the Martyrs or Wormbrand-inspired missions really took off, and that was the same here in Canada. And it became very much a part of the Brobbel life for sure.
Now, you didn't want to be involved with the persecuted church because you've seen, these photos of some pretty graphic things of what Christians went through for their faith. So tell me about what it was like as a child and being exposed to that.
Yeah, I think it was both fascinating and horrifying at the same time. It was fascinating to meet the Wormbrandts. It was fascinating to have them in our home, even as kids, listening to Pastor Wormbrand speak or being with Sabina Wormbrand at the book table. It was a fascinating time, and I think that we were, as kids, my brother and sister and I were enthralled by his message. But for me, and I think my siblings as well, we also then got exposed to some pretty graphic things. So, we would see some photographs of persecuted Christians or Christians that had been martyred, or, hear some of the stories from Richard Wormbrand. And I think at that time, it was difficult to know how to disseminate this type of information for kids. And so for me, all I could associate persecution with was the terrible things I saw or heard. And that kind of scared me from the ministry. So I kept the ministry at arm's length. Certainly I felt sorry for persecuted Christians, which, we come to discover now, and same with you, Greg, have known that's not what they want. They don't want us to pity them or feel sorry for them. But that time, I felt sorry for them, and that would motivate me from time to time to pray for them, pray for persecuted Christians. But for that message, that if every Christian can expect to be persecuted, that was a scary thing for me to embrace, simply because I didn't understand what that meant, and all I could equate persecution with was the Wormbrand stories, right? Thrown in prison, tortured horribly, and him telling stories of how pastors and Christians were martyred or killed in prison. I just kind of at that point just mentally checked out, if you will.
Yeah, I guess if you don't have to see it, maybe it won't happen to you. But you
That's
did
right.
have personal contact with Richard and Sabrina Wormbrand. And again, I think there's the generation before you and I, most of them had that personal connection with Richard. The new generation, yourself and others leading around the world. But you're one of the few, Floyd, that actually has that personal connection. Maybe not as much to Richard, but, certainly Sabina.
To both. Richard was also always, of course, very busy, and whenever they were stayed at our home, we got bombarded by many Russian-speaking visitors and guests, and a whole new culture opened up to us. And our house was full of loud-speaking people, all wanting to meet Richard Wurmbrandt and Sabina, of course. But it was in sometimes those quiet moments that we got to know Richard and Sabina. So, when they would leave our house and they would write a check to my parents and say, "This is for the kids." And we were always thrilled because it was a U.S. check, which means that if it was $25 per kid U.S., of course, it was more Canadian. Mm-hmm. So they would always leave a little gift for us and encourage us. And at meetings, we would listen to Richard speak, but we would often be with Sabina at the book table, helping her do all kinds of things, watching her work her magic and getting the books, the Wurmbrandt books into people's hands, and her bundle deals and all those things. And she was quite a force at the book table, and we enjoyed those moments with them when we had them.
So what changed then, Floyd? I mean, you grew up in St. Thomas, Ontario. You go on to school, you start pursuing a career. And then in the early 2000s, your heart either started to change, because I remember the first time we met was at a conference out in Ontario. And,
right.
You were kind of in that point, I guess, what is God calling me to do now? You sort of were in between. Did you ever dream, though, that it would be the Voice of the Martyrs and the ministry that your mom and dad started?
Yeah, I guess always in the back of my mind, I had a feeling that I would end up with Voice of the Martyrs in some capacity. At the time that you were referring to, I was working in a wholesale company, and I was working my way up the ladder, if you will. Had done a number of jobs and working my way into management, and was in management and team leading in a department, and then eventually managing in a department. But yeah, I received a call one day from my mom, and she just called out of the blue, and she had this message that a son of one of the directors had been killed in a hit and run. And this was the son of Dr. P.P. Job in India, who was leading a Wurmbrandt ministry in India. And he believed that his son, Michael, I think it was a third-year medical student, was targeted by those who opposed him and his work. And they decided to target his son. And as he was walking down the street, they ran him over with a car, and it was a hit and run. And I think he died fairly shortly after that accident. And so my mom called to tell me this story. I didn't know Michael. Of course, I knew of Michael. I knew of Dr. Job and his work in India. So I knew that, a little bit of his family. But for some reason, that story it resonated. And I equate it with, like, when you throw a pebble in some water, you see it make a little dent, but then the ripples become bigger and bigger. And I think that story did that in my heart. I knew that for some reason the story was registering, but then over the years, the ripple effect, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And it all culminated to a point where I think in that very same conference we met, Greg, that all the ICA, all the VOM ministry leaders were at a conference, and you were there filming and interviewing certain speakers. And I think I was leading worship for the conference. And then on the Sunday, we actually had Dr. P.P. Job come and speak in our church. Right. And it was at that church service then that he started speaking about losing his son and sharing that story. And of course, that just brought up this whole effect again for me. And I just felt the Lord speaking to my heart as Dr. Job was sharing, just asking if I was ready to follow him. And I said, yeah, I was ready to follow. And that certainly was the call that Dr. Job was giving. Are we willing to follow, even if it means a road of suffering? And many people were responding to that call, and I was one of them. And then as soon as I said, yes, Lord, I'm willing to follow you, he also then said, even if that means working for Voice of the Martyrs. And there was a little bit of a hesitancy on my part, but then yes, I said, yes, Lord, even if it means working for Voice of the Martyrs. And so you just see the Lord bringing it full circle back at me. And I remember him clearly asking me at one point, and again, just the Lord speaking to my heart, asking me, since when is your life about what you want? What about the plans that I have for you? What about the plans that I planned for you before you were even born? And so I said, yes, I want to follow that plan. And that eventually led me to calling up Glenn Penner, who was then the not CEO, he was the development director, I believe, at VOM Canada, and we started chatting, and I became an approved rep, much like you, Greg.
Yeah.
We were, I think, the first 2 or 3 approved reps of VOM Canada, and that's how it started.
And then eventually you took a trip overseas. And I mean, I think one of the things, if you can get somebody overseas, it really does something. It'll either say, that's it, I don't want nothing to do with this, or like you and I, just got a big hook into our hearts. So how has it affected you this past 20 years, Floyd, traveling around the world, meeting persecuted Christians? Because again, as a child, you had this, this fear that maybe if you got too close to it, you might end up like them, but you start to meet them and hear their stories. How did that impact you?
Yeah, I whenever anybody asks me that question, I think of Hebrews 11, and I think of that line in Hebrews 11. I forget what number verse it is, but then there are those that the world is not worthy of. Or these are those that the world is not worthy of. And I think of, we get to sit, Greg, when we go overseas, we get to sit with people that the world's not worthy of, because they seek to live their life for Jesus, and they don't want to necessarily suffer. It's not like they're asking for persecution, but if it comes, it comes, and they live their lives for God, and they realize that, if they lose their life on this earth, then they gain it. And so they ask us that, their number one prayer is that we pray that they would remain faithful to their Lord and Savior. And time and time again, when you meet and sit with persecuted Christians and they tell their stories of hardship, I mean, that's the general theme that comes out. And how can you not be impacted and motivated by that? When you hear stories of forgiveness, of people, sometimes working through forgiveness for some of the hard things and persecution that they went through. And oftentimes, though, we hear stories where forgiveness is instant. And it's just simply because of the road that they've walked, that they've entered into this relationship with Jesus, many of them converting to Christianity, leaving their former religion. And so they come to Christ knowing that there's a cost to pay. And so then when things happen, they're not caught off guard by the persecution that comes their way. And so they then also are in a much better place to quickly forgive. And I know that you and I have sat through many interviews, one of them, Pastor Lalani in Sri Lanka, where her husband was killed, and they just had a little boy, and she was in the ambulance realizing that she was transporting her dead husband to the hospital. And yet there was this instant forgiveness for the people that killed her husband, and then an instant love for them, that she would continue to do the work and minister to them. Yeah, when you sit and listen to those stories, not just online or not through a video, but face to face, we're sitting down having a meal with her, and she's telling the story and the tears and all these things, the expressions of listening to someone relate that. Yeah, your life has changed, and you realize that there's so much that we can learn from these people, more than maybe even a sermon could ever teach us, because it's real. It's sometimes we hear people in their most rawest moments where they share, and like Tortured for Christ. I think one of the powerful elements of that book is that it's raw. Richard Wurmbrand was ransomed out of Romania, and I think he spent the first 3 days in his freedom writing that book. It's raw, it's real, and it cuts to the heart with some of the things that he says, and same with the testimonies of those that we hear.
Yeah, you mentioned Lalani, and I'm, and as a question and answer time, it's sometimes at the end of a church service or a conference, or I'm asked, who's the most impacting Christian? I said, well, there's a long list. There's Kelly in Colombia. There's, the list goes, Mrs. Kim from North Korea, but Lalani from Sri Lanka is, right up there. It's just an amazing story. So for 20 years, you have been involved with the Voice of the Martyrs. You're now the CEO of the ministry, and you've written a book called Trouble on the Way. And I know this has been brewing a long time, and our good mutual friend, Dr. Eric Foley, Voice of the Martyrs in Korea, good friend of ours, kept encouraging you to write it. So finally, you started to work on it, and you started to formulate the thoughts. So when you sat down and started to write, Floyd, what was the goal of the book?
I think. Well, first of all, I had a different book in mind, and I started to write with that book in mind and the theme of that book. But as I opened up this book and really started the introduction, wrestling with persecution, I just realized that this was the book. Trouble on the Way was the book that needed to be written, focusing on the persecution scale, the levels of persecution or the degrees of persecution that we see. But my heart and my hope was that I would be able to primarily address a Western audience not acquainted with persecution. So as a kid, you heard my story, how I struggled with understanding persecution, and then being blessed to be able to join VOM and sit with people like Glenn Penner and who wrote In the Shadow of the Cross, the theology of persecution and discipleship, and then take those elements and see overseas and meet firsthand persecuted Christians, how they are practically living out their faith and how they're dealing with the different levels of persecution that come their way. And then looking to us and looking at me in the West and say, I am so woefully unprepared for anything that comes my way. And I started looking at our persecution scale that starts with ridicule and works its way through the varying degrees, harassment, defamation, moving to more of the hostile forms of persecution with imprisonment, torture, right to martyrdom. And thinking, how can I write something? How can I convey to people like me, Christians in Canada or in the US, wherever they are, that are grappling with what does persecution look like for me? Because we read in the Bible, like we know that one in Timothy, right? That we hear everybody or everyone that seeks to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And we're trying to get our heads around that fact. Yeah. What does that look like? And I think sometimes we think that persecution is only the hard things that come, right? So it only starts when you get imprisoned for your faith, or when you get tortured or beaten up, right? We don't think some of the lighter stuff as a form of persecution, but then on the other scale, you get people that call everything persecution.
Right, and I just interject. Yeah, I was just going to interject. I think one of the things that Glenn Penner had said is if you make everything about persecution, then it diminishes persecution. Now, if somebody is sick, well, that's not persecution, or going through financial difficulty, unless the reason you're suffering that financial difficulty is because you are a Christian. So I think Glenn, Glenn was a brilliant theologian. I know he got you and I thinking a lot. What is true persecution? So I think if we don't have that sort of that grid, and there's things that have been happening in Canada over COVID, and we won't get into that too much because if you want to hear a podcast, Don Hutchison, who is a lawyer, we discussed that on a previous Closer to the Fire episode. But we do have to work through what the Bible says. So let's start off with ridicule from your book, because I think a lot of people could say, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm a Christian, and okay, I don't go through what they go through in Pakistan." That's true, but that doesn't mean you're not being persecuted. So ridicule is kind of where it starts. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting place to start, because I don't think most people would see ridicule as persecution. But if you think what is the intent of persecution and what is the intent of the persecutor, right? The intent of persecution and the intent of the persecutor is to shut down Christian witness or destroy Christian witness, right? Mm-hmm. Now, sadly, for many of us in the West, ridicule is a form that does it for us. Now, ridicule can be a constant, ongoing thing, right? And so we don't want to necessarily say it's a lesser form of persecution, because it can be just as effective as some of the more extreme forms of persecution that come our way, right? And so I don't think at the end of our life we're going to come and say, well, I wasn't really as persecuted as that person, so I'm not as good, right? I don't think the level or the amount of persecution that we face in life is what counts. It's our faithfulness, right, in the midst of whatever opposition we face that matters. And so for the West, I think many of us have to grapple with being uncomfortable and being willing to be ridiculed for our faith, right? And so how is ridicule being effective? I think it's effective because many Christians want to live a private faith. We're told that faith is meant to be private. And yet the Bible teaches us that we are to go into all the world and preach the gospel and make disciples. Well, how can you do that if your faith is private, right? So when we step out, when we talk to our neighbors, or when we meet people in the street, or we engage people in our sphere of influence or community, and what we may call, whether we're just having conversation, saying, oh yeah, I'm a believer, I go to church, I'm a follower of Jesus, or we engage in more active forms of evangelism, ridicule often comes our way. We get people that sneer at us, we get people that laugh at us, we get people that would make fun of us. And for us, that's uncomfortable for us. And sadly, for many of us, that's enough to say, no, I won't engage in that unless I know it's safe. Well, yeah. Persecution then under ridicule has done its work.
Right. And I know even in the communist world, okay, you just keep it, private. It, even right. Here in Canada until, maybe 20 years ago, it was okay. And if you're a Christian, there's lots of churches, and there's still lots right. of churches, but, people were a little bit more open in sharing their faith. But I think that this whole ridicule thing, to me, and again, that's where you start, is very applicable to here in Canada. And again, where Paul is talking to his understudy Timothy, again, if you desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted. So is that a tie in there then, Floyd, that living a godly life in Christ Jesus is proclaiming the gospel?
Yeah, I think our friend Eric Foley says it best, right? That persecution is a result of faithful witness. And if we are faithful witnesses, and again, martyrs for Christ, that means a willingness to lay down our lives and to lay down and die to self, and also being willing to face, death as a result of being a witness for Jesus. Faithful witness. If we are faithful in our witness, we will face some level of opposition and persecution. And when I say opposition, I don't mean to separate the two. I think they can be one and the same. Yeah.
Now, in your book, you use a fictional character in one sense, but it is a culmination of all different right. kinds of persecution. And next week, we're going to talk, about torture and imprisonment, and then ultimately martyrdom. And so in your book, though, you have this fictitious character again, but it's kind of based on real life people. Because when I started reading it, I said, Floyd, who are you talking about here? Because I'm going, I think this is this country and this country. So what you did was you use that character to weave in the various kinds of persecution, because you wanted to bring an element to it. And I tell you, I got really hooked into the character. And
good.
You did a great job on it. And I was feeling the emotion. And even though I knew that, okay, but then I would think about people that I'd met and the situations that they were going through. So I love the way you weaved it together. So we start with ridicule. Many Canadians, those in the West, can understand, okay, if I proclaim Jesus, that I might go through some difficulty. Then you move on to harassment. And reality is most of us probably don't face that kind of persecution unless maybe it's in a work situation, that kind of thing. But it's a step up, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And we'll see and sometimes those things can happen very quickly. You can move from ridicule to discrimination to defamation to harassment quite quickly. You could even do it, and maybe in the same time of opposition, if you will. Yeah, so the harassment level really does intensify the situation, and I think we would feel that as well. And so you can think about, for example, if you're out on the street, let's say you're evangelizing, you've decided that you're going to go house to house and hand out gospel tracts. And so you do that, and you might get to one house and you hand a tract to someone, and he begins to laugh and scoff and call you names. And maybe as you enter that conversation, you might feel some words that are discriminatory towards Christians, and then you might quickly, depending on the person, could easily boil over to some form of harassment where, they know who you are, or they know where you live, and they elevate their game, so to speak, and maybe send you hate mail, or get a hold of your email and bombard you with emails, or drive by your house. Always when they're driving by, they have a threatening look on their face, or an angry look on or when you meet them in the street, or things like that. So that really does bring a whole new level of intensity to the opposition that you are facing because of the gospel. But again, I think that these are very real things that can happen in Canada. I think that we should be prepared. There's this one quote that a ministry partner told me, said that you can't be caught off guard by anything you anticipate. And I don't think that in Canada we anticipate, as Christians, we don't sit down and think about the consequences of our faith and living out our faith, and anticipating the things that can come our way. And I think that's Richard Wurmbrand always bemoaned that fact as well. And he wrote a little book called Preparing for the Underground Church. And he talked about how the different ways that we can prepare and anticipate some of the struggles that would come our way, because we do need to be ready. And I think that in Canada, I think many Christians, and I think maybe that's what with the whole COVID thing, and some of the restrictions that we're seeing in the church, maybe some of the backlash we're getting there from churches is that they are starting to sense that, hey, the Canada I grew up in is not the same country. The freedoms that I enjoyed as a kid, or that we felt that we had as Christians, it just doesn't seem to be there, or they're slipping, or they're eroding. And so their reaction to the the COVID restrictions might be the fuel of that. But and that's fine. But I think that we need to do a better job, I think, at anticipating the things that could be coming our way, and whether that be discrimination. How do we handle discrimination? How do we handle when the press malign us in the media? And that's happening already.
Sure. But
how do we handle that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the book, what I try to do in the book is to look also at, well, how did Jesus handle these things? Because Jesus faced all those things, right, from the persecution scale. And so I do try to take a close look at how Jesus handled those things as well, so that it just prepares our hearts to be able to prepare for, whatever persecution comes our way. We don't know, in Canada, we don't know, will persecution come to us like house church Christians in China, or Christians in Saudi Arabia, or North Korea? I mean, it's possible, but we don't know. But I think we need to be prepared for any type of persecution that comes our way.
Yeah, and a good point that Don Hutchinson made, as he was talking about, as we were, this situation with this pastor in Alberta and other churches that have chose to meet at full capacity here in Alberta, when you could have 15% at the time of this interview that we're doing now. So I get it too. Like, there is the psychological part. We've seen Canada going in a direction very secular, becoming more antagonistic towards Christianity, especially on the moral issues. So those are those things are at play. We see it coming, and I guess some are saying, no, it's happening now,
Right.
or we see it very close. And I understand that. And, my heart in this is that we have grace and mercy for each other. Let's not let this divide us, because even we've seen division as we've traveled overseas. Just in a persecuted church, one thing I always like to say, they're not perfect. They're just like us. So, okay, I want to just go from your book here. And again, I would encourage people to get it, Trouble on the Way. So we talked about ridicule, which means to deride, make fun of, or mock. Harassment, to disturb, pester, trouble repeatedly. And in some cases, as you were talking about, things come to mind. Now we move to discrimination. It's to treat or consider or distinguish in favor of or against religious intolerance. Now, many of the nations that we have traveled to, that's a reality. And I mean, that's what our brothers and sisters are going through. So as you were working through the book, how did you want to tackle that?
Yeah, so the discrimination part is it becomes real problematic for Christians, because they find that much of the majority of society actually starts to believe the disinformation that has been spread about Christians. So, for example, in some countries, Christianity is tied to the West because of colonialism. And so they say Christianity, and then it will be propagated throughout the media, throughout, whatever other sources there are, certainly through the majority religious communities, that, Christianity is a Western religion, and therefore it has no real ties to our country, or to our, to a citizen of our country, whether it be Pakistan or Sri Lanka, whatever country that is.
Christianity often, like a country like India, and modern day Pakistan, a part of that actually has a history of St. Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples. So this American thing or Western thing just keeps being brought up, but we go, no, it's not. Maybe the version of Christianity that Christianity in these, it's not, we're trying to impose this foreign religion. It's something that's been there for 2,000 years in many cases.
Yeah, that's right. And I think in many of these countries, the regular citizen may not know necessarily the history of their country in terms of the religious movements that have come through their country, and certainly with Christianity. But they would certainly know more about colonialism, and they would certainly know about the missionary movement that came as a result of colonial activities. And now, having become independent and gained their independence, they then want to find their own identity. And often, of course, people find their identity in their religion, and same with countries, right? And so many of the governments would say that they would, they adhere to freedom of religion as found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But to say one thing and then to practice it is a whole other thing, right? And then the issue that Christians have is that with this disinformation that comes in, then society begins to accept those things as true. And then once society accepts those things as true, discrimination sets in, and Christians find that they have no real voice anymore to counteract some of the disinformation that is out there. And I think maybe that's a bit of the concern that Christians have in the West, right? That they certainly find that there is a lot of disinformation about the Christian faith, evangelicals or whatnot. And they find that right now we still have a bit of a voice in the media or press, that we can address those concerns and certainly try to lay some of that disinformation to rest, bring some truth into the situation. But for many other countries, that's not possible. And so, they have to continue to live out their faith then under this umbrella of disinformation and discrimination. And what does discrimination look like? Well, we know in Pakistan, for example, that most Christians are relegated to, they're in cycles of poverty and don't have access to quality education. And so they're relegated to, cleaning homes or garbage collectors or sewage cleaners or street sweepers, right? In Iran, it is illegal for you to have any rank if you're a Christian of authority in the army. and you can't rise to certain levels politically as a Christian. And so we see that discrimination come in many other countries as well, where the same rights that are available to regular citizens are not available to Christian communities. And I have to say, other religious minorities in those countries suffer as well. When we think of communism, Richard and Sabrina wrote that not only Christians thrown in prison, other religions, whether they were Buddhist or Muslim, practicing Buddhists or Muslims, they were also thrown in prison, right, under those systems. And so other religious minorities suffer as well.
Right, and we see that even with the Uyghurs in China. So then discrimination leads into defamation, and your explanation here is to communicate false statements about a person that injures the reputation of that person. And we see a lot of that, Floyd, as we've traveled.
Yeah, that's right. And it's hard to, once that sets in, that's hard to shake off. And I think that the best way that you counteract that is as we see them doing, they just continue to live out their lives. It's interesting. In some of these countries, when there's a natural disaster that happens, government agencies will contact Christian organizations and churches first, because they know that they will be the first to respond with acts of humanitarian aid and acts of service and love, because they do love their country and they love their fellow men. And so that's how they serve. And yet, there's this stigma attached to them that they can't shake. And so how do you shake it? Well, you continue to do the work of the Great Commission, right? In the spirit of the Great Commandment, you continue to make disciples, you continue to pay the price for reaching the lost, and you do it in a spirit of loving God and loving your neighbor. And that is an effective tool, right? It is done and watered with prayer, and they go out and they make disciples. And it's interesting to note, right, that while we Christians in the West often celebrate our freedom, our churches are in decline. And yet in countries where Christians are facing these things, even that where they are defamed and they're called all kinds of names and they face such discrimination, the church is growing, it's booming, it's exploding in some areas. And that's just such an amazing thing, and a testimony to what happens when you follow the biblical commands to be faithful in your witness and trusting God to continue to supply your needs. Again, as you mentioned, they're not perfect, and they make mistakes, and they fight with unity issues just like we do. But at the end of the day, they are faithful in their witness and active, and I would say active witness. Public witness of Christ, and the results are clear.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there with Floyd Brobbel, but I promise that next time we will continue this discussion on the levels of persecution. And I hope that this is helping you to understand that, as a follower of Jesus, we are going to have opposition. So next time we're going to look at detainment, torture, and martyrdom. And what does martyrdom look like? Is that beyond dying for your faith? We'll explore that next time. By the way, if you'd like to get a copy of Floyd's excellent book, Trouble on the Way, Persecution in the Christian Life, you can go to vomcanada.com/trouble. That's vomcanada.com/trouble. Well, thanks for joining me. And remember, the closer you are to Jesus, the closer you are to the fire.